There are 18 motorcycles sitting in dealerships right now that most riders under 30 have never even heard of. But older riders know something the rest of the market doesn't. These bikes are cheap. They're forgiving. They're gentle on aging joints and aging backs. And they quietly outsell flashy sport bikes in one very specific age group. Nobody makes videos about them because they don't look exciting in a thumbnail. No wheelies. No neon paint. No roaring exhaust ripping down a highway at midnight. But if you're over 50 and you want to keep riding for another 20 years without wrecking your knees or your bank account, this might be the most useful video you watch this month. Stay with me, because bike number 1 on this list is sitting in almost every Honda dealership in the country. And almost nobody understands why seniors are buying it in record numbers. Here's why this actually matters. As riders get older, the exact things that made a motorcycle thrilling in their 20s start quietly turning against them. Weight becomes a problem. Seat height becomes a problem. Vibration in the handlebars becomes a problem. A bike that once felt like pure freedom at 25 can start feeling like a wrestling match at 65. So a shift has been happening behind the scenes, one most of the industry barely talks about. Manufacturers have been building lighter, lower, smoother machines. And older riders have been quietly finding them, buying them, and falling in love with them. While younger buyers scroll straight past because they're not cool enough for a highlight reel. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly which 18 bikes are winning this quiet and glamorous war, why each one earns its place on this list, and what to actually look for if you or someone you love is thinking about getting back onto wheels. Let's start with the bike that arguably started this entire trend. Picture a man in his early 60s. He hasn't touched a motorcycle in 15 years, and he walks into the dealership already bracing for that old feeling of intimidation. Then he sits on a Honda Rebel 300, and something unexpected happens. He relaxes. That reaction isn't luck. Honda built this bike almost like a chair with wheels. At just under 28 inches, the seat sits low enough that nearly anyone can plant both feet flat on the ground at a stop. And that single detail matters more than most people realize. Because the fear of tipping over is one of the biggest silent reasons older riders quietly give up motorcycles for good. The engine is small, smooth, and nowhere near as aggressive as the machines many of these riders remember from decades ago. Here's the surprising part. Though this bike isn't gentle because it's cheap. It's tuned to be smooth on purpose, because Honda knows exactly who's really buying it. But a low seat and a friendly price tag only solve half the equation. What happens when a rider needs a little more muscle without losing that same relaxed confidence? That question is exactly what the next bike on this list was built to answer. The Honda Rebel 500 exists for one very specific moment, the highway on-ramp that used to make a rider's stomach drop. It shares the same low, relaxed stance as its smaller sibling, but with just enough extra power under 471 cc to merge into fast traffic without feeling like the bike is gasping for breath. Seniors who ride longer distances, maybe visiting grandkids to towns over, or chasing old friends on a weekend ride, often graduate here because it erases the one real complaint people have about smaller machines. It still keeps that forgiving seat height. It still keeps the weight manageable enough that a rider doesn't need to muscle a 400-plus pound machine out of a tight parking spot alone. But here's what almost nobody mentions until they've owned one for a year. It barely asks for anything in return. And when your body no longer wants to spend every other weekend bent over an engine, that single detail matters more than horsepower ever could. That idea, a bike that asks for almost nothing, connects directly to something much bigger happening across this entire market. And it explains our next entry perfectly. At first glance, the Yamaha V-Star 250 looks almost too small to matter. And that's exactly the point. This bike is embarrassingly light by cruiser standards, tipping the scales at barely over 300 pounds, and for a lot of older riders, that number changes everything. These aren't people trying to prove anything anymore. They just want to feel the wind on a Sunday afternoon and get home without their back aching for 3 days afterward. Because this bike weighs so little, dropping it at a stoplight, one of the most common fears among returning riders, becomes far less catastrophic, and far less likely in the first place. It carries that classic, timeless cruiser silhouette so many older riders grew up admiring, but without a single ounce of the punishing weight that came standard on machines from that same era. Still, Lightweight bikes come with a trade-off nobody likes to admit out loud. And it's worth being honest about before moving forward. Lighter bikes can start to feel a little nervous at real highway speed. And that's precisely the gap the next motorcycle was designed to close. The Suzuki Boulevard S40 lives in an unusually smart middle ground. It keeps that low, relaxed cruiser posture that's kind to aging wrists and shoulders. But it carries just enough weight, close to 400 pounds. And just enough stability to feel confident once the needle passes 40 miles an hour. Riders in their 60s and 70s who've tried this bike almost always describe the same sensation. It doesn't fight them. The clutch pull is light. The controls don't demand a death grip. And because a version of this bike has quietly existed for decades, parts and mechanics who know it inside and out are everywhere. Which matters far more than people expect when you'd rather spend your golden years riding than hunting down a specialist repair shop 3 counties away. Just when you think this list is only going to be about cruisers, something completely different shows up next, and it might be the biggest surprise so far. Here's where things get interesting. The Honda CB300 doesn't look like a senior bike at all. It looks modern, almost aggressive, the exact kind of bike a 25-year-old would post online. But hidden underneath that sharp styling is something older riders have quietly discovered on their own, an upright seating position that's genuinely gentler on the lower back than a traditional cruiser slouch. Physical therapists have pointed out for years that leaning too far back or hunching too far forward for long stretches can aggravate spine issues that already exist. And this bike's neutral riding stance solves that without anyone having to explain a thing. At around 316 pounds, it's light, it's nimble, and it turns tight parking lot maneuvers from a nerve-wracking chore into something almost effortless. But looks can deceive in the opposite direction too, and the next bike on this list proves that some of the most senior-friendly machines out there don't look friendly at all. The Kawasaki Vulcan 500 wears an old-school cruiser silhouette that instantly puts nostalgic riders at ease, the kind of shape that immediately feels familiar. But don't let that classic look fool you. Under the surface, it's been refined to be smoother and far easier to manage than its appearance suggests. Riders who grew up idolizing massive American cruisers, but no longer want the weight and vibration that came bundled with them, often land here as a compromise that doesn't feel like a compromise at all. It looks like the bike they remember from their 20s. It rides like something built for the person they've become since. And that emotional connection, feeling like your younger self while riding like your wiser self, turns out to be one of the most powerful, underrated reasons a senior falls in love with one specific motorcycle over all the others. Speaking of emotional connection, the next bike on this list reaches even deeper. Straight into heritage itself. Imagine hearing an engine that sounds exactly like the one your father rode decades ago, except it starts every single time and rarely asks for a wrench. That's the entire appeal of the Royal Enfield Classic 350. It's thumping. Old-fashioned exhaust note transports a lot of older riders straight back to motorcycles from their youth, long before bikes became quiet and clinical and electronic. But underneath that vintage charm sits a modern, low-maintenance 349cc engine that doesn't demand constant attention the way the originals did. It's affordable. It's mechanically simple. And it carries a quiet kind of confidence, the kind that only comes from riding something with real history behind it, instead of whatever happens to be newest on the showroom floor this year. If nostalgia is part of the appeal here, get ready. Because the next bike on this list turns that same idea into an entire riding philosophy. The Yamaha SR400 is proof that simplicity still sells. Especially to riders who've already owned dozens of overcomplicated machines throughout their lives and are done being impressed by gadgets. There's no elaborate electronics package here. No unnecessary screens or modes. Just a straightforward, dependable engine and a design that hasn't changed much in decades, because it never needed to. Seniors who value predictability over raw performance gravitate toward bikes exactly like this one. And the logic is simple: less that can go wrong means more time actually enjoying the ride, instead of troubleshooting it in a driveway. Once you understand that appeal, the reasoning behind the next bike on this list becomes almost obvious. The Suzuki T50X follows that same back-to-basics philosophy, but wraps it in an even smaller, even lighter, even friendlier package weighing barely over 300 pounds. It's usually marketed toward first-time riders, but here's the part almost nobody mentions. A huge share of its real-world buyers aren't beginners at all. They're returning riders in their 50s and 60s who haven't touched a motorcycle in decades and want something forgiving to relearn on before going any bigger. It's cheap to insure, cheap to fuel, and light enough to push around a garage single-handed without straining anything. Sometimes going back to basics isn't a step down at all. Sometimes it's exactly what real experience teaches you to want. But not every senior wants to go smaller, and that opens up a category this list hasn't touched yet. The Honda Shadow Aero 750 proves you can go bigger without making the bike harder to live with. It has genuine cruiser presence, real weight, real highway comfort for longer rides, but Honda balanced it so carefully that it still feels manageable at low speed, which is exactly where nervous or aging riders tend to struggle the most. Long-time riders who refuse to feel like they're downgrading as they age often choose this bike specifically because it still feels substantial in the saddle, just without the punishing top heaviness that plagued older cruiser designs from decades past. That balance between size and control becomes even more important with the next entry. Because this bike pushes comfort further than most people expect from something this affordable. Imagine finishing a tour ride, stepping off the bike, and realizing your back doesn't hurt at all. That's the entire sales pitch for the Kawasaki Vulcan 900 Custom, and it barely needs anything else. The seat is wide, the suspension soaks up bumps that would rattle smaller bikes apart, and the riding position practically invites long and hurried cruises instead of aggressive stop-and-go riding. For seniors who've made peace with the fact that comfort now matters more than acceleration, this bike hits a spot that's genuinely hard to find anywhere else in this price range. And once comfort becomes the priority, one specific design feature starts repeating across the rest of this list. Starting right now, the Honda CMX 500 Rebel takes everything that made the smaller Rebel so popular and scales it up just enough for taller or heavier riders who felt cramped on the 300. Same low-seat philosophy that made the first two bikes on this list so approachable. Same beginner-friendly manners, but with a bit more room to stretch out, and enough extra power from its 471cc engine to merge confidently onto a busy highway. It's quietly become a bridge bike, the one riders reach for once they've outgrown the smallest Rebel but still aren't ready for something heavy and demanding. That idea of a bridge bike matters a lot here, because the next motorcycle plays a nearly identical role in a completely different style of riding. At first glance, the Triumph Bonneville T10 looks like it should cost far more than it actually does. Classic British styling, genuinely premium ride quality, the kind of bike that turns heads without even trying. But here's the surprising part. Used and slightly older models regularly land in a price range that rivals bikes half as refined. Seniors who care about craftsmanship, who want a machine that feels special every single time they walk into the garage, often choose this over cheaper, blander alternatives. Because the emotional payoff of riding something beautiful is worth far more to them than saving a few $100s ever could be. But not every rider on this list even wants a motorcycle in the traditional sense. And that leads into a category some purists refuse to count as real motorcycles. Even though seniors are buying them by the thousands, here's a detail that changes everything for a lot of aging riders: no clutch, no shifting, no risk of stalling out in front of traffic at a red light. That single feature is the entire reason the Honda PCX 150 scooter has quietly become one of the most popular choices among older riders in busy towns and cities. For seniors dealing with arthritis or reduced grip strength, that one design choice can be the difference between riding and simply giving up on riding altogether. It's cheap to buy, remarkably fuel efficient, and it turns something as mundane as running errands into a small daily pleasure instead of a chore. And if that kind of effortless, automatic convenience sounds appealing, the next bike on this list takes the idea even further. The Vespa Primavera 150 proves that practicality and style were never actually opposites. It offers that same easy, automatic riding experience as the Honda scooter before it, but wraps it in a design so iconic that riders often admit it makes them feel younger just standing next to it in T driveway. There's something genuinely powerful about a vehicle that makes you smile before you've even turned the key. And for a lot of older riders, that emotional lift is worth every penny of the price tag on its own. Speaking of price, though, the next bike on this list takes affordability to an almost extreme level. And it might be the most overlooked motorcycle in this entire lineup. Almost nobody talks about the Suzuki GZ250. And honestly, that's a mistake, because it quietly checks nearly every box a senior rider actually cares about. It's light, well under 300 pounds. It's cheap to buy. It's cheap to maintain year after year. And it has a seat height low enough that almost anyone can manage it confidently. It simply doesn't have the marketing budget or flashy image of the bigger brands. So it slips under the radar despite being one of the most sensible first or comeback bikes available anywhere on the used market today. Sometimes the best options really are the ones nobody's shouting about. And speaking of options nobody expects, the next entry might be the single biggest surprise on this entire list. Here's something that breaks the stereotype completely. The Harley-Davidson Street 500 isn't built for riders chasing a loud, aggressive image at all. This particular model was engineered specifically to be smaller, lighter, and far easier to handle than the brand's massive touring machines, while still carrying that unmistakable Harley badge and exhaust note so many older riders spent their whole lives dreaming about. It finally lets someone own the brand they always wanted, without wrestling the intimidating weight that comes standard on the bigger models. For a lot of lifelong Harley fans in their 60s and 70s, that combination feels like a dream quietly arriving decades later, just on far more forgiving terms than they ever expected. Before we get to the final few bikes on this list, if this kind of practical, no-nonsense content is actually useful to you, tapping like and subscribing genuinely helps more people find videos like this one instead of flashy content that never actually helps anyone make a real decision. The Kawasaki W800 brings retro styling paired with genuinely modern reliability, giving older riders that vintage British bike look without any of the constant mechanical headaches those original bikes were famous for. It's smooth, refreshingly simple to operate, and it rides with a calm and hurried character that matches exactly the kind of relaxed riding most seniors are chasing at this stage of life. There's a reason this bike keeps resurfacing in online forums where retired riders swap recommendations back and forth. And it has everything to do with how little drama it brings into daily ownership. But drama-free riding takes on a whole new meaning with the next entry, because this bike solves a problem that's almost unique to aging riders specifically. The Yamaha Bolt strips the cruiser down to its essentials and pairs that minimalism with genuinely light, easy handling, making it one of the simplest bikes on this list to maneuver at true parking lot speed, exactly where most low-speed tip-overs actually happen. Seniors who've had a scare at a stop sign, or felt that stomach-drop moment in a crowded lot, often specifically seek out a bike like this one, because confidence at low speed matters just as much, if not more, than confidence out on the open highway. And that brings us to the final bike on this list, one that ties every single lesson from this video together into a single machine. Here's the part that might surprise you the most. The Honda Goldwing, specifically older, used models from a decade or two back, might seem like an odd note to end on, since brand new ones are far from cheap. But those older Goldwings have quietly dropped into surprisingly affordable territory on the used market, and they remain, hands down, one of the most comfortable long-distance touring machines ever built. Full weather protection, plush seating designed for hours in the saddle, and a stability at speed that few other bikes on this entire list can match. For seniors finally planning that long road trip they always talked about but never got around to, this used touring giant offers a level of comfort smaller bikes simply cannot replicate, all at a price that would have seemed impossible back when it first rolled off the showroom floor. So here's the biggest takeaway from everything we just covered. The best motorcycle for an older rider was never about horsepower, top speed, or how many heads it turns on the highway. It's about a seat low enough to make stopping less scary, a body light enough to make parking lots less stressful, an engine smooth enough to make every ride feel calm instead of chaotic. And honestly, it's about finally accepting that riding well into your 60s, 70s, and beyond was never about proving anything to anyone else. It's simply about the freedom of the open road, minus the fear that used to come attached to it. If you or someone you love is thinking about getting back onto wheels later in life, which one of these 18 bikes would you actually choose, and why? Drop it in the comments below, because some of the best real-world advice on this exact topic comes from riders who've genuinely lived it, not from a script. And if this helped, there's another video waiting for you right now that breaks down the biggest mistakes new and returning riders make in their very first year back on a motorcycle. Mistakes that are completely avoidable once you actually know what to look for.